Imagine a place among sandy dunes and arid hills, where the sand temperature reaches 70 degrees Celsius in the summer, and it might not rain for months. There are no major rivers, no lakes, and almost nothing you would typically associate with the fishing industry. Anyone would say that under these conditions, it is tough to grow even weeds. But right now, thousands of tons of fish are swimming in huge tanks in the middle of this heat. They are fed, sorted, sent for processing, and delivered to stores. How is that even possible? And who came up with such an idea? It all seems like something out of science fiction. But we are talking about a real Israeli project that has been successfully operating for several years in the Negev desert. How did a country used to saving every drop of water arrive at such a solution? The deeper you dig into this story, the clearer it becomes that the secret was not hidden in the sea, not in rivers, and not in advanced technologies. It was always deep underground, in a place no one even thought to look. If you look at a map of Israel, you will see that the Negev desert takes up almost half of its territory. From a bird's eye view, it looks like endless expanses of rock, sand, and sun-scorched plateaus. In some places, there is so little rainfall that any patch of green seems almost accidental. Many travelers who find themselves here for the first time describe the same feeling. You get the impression that the land itself is constantly reminding you of the serious water shortage. Despite this, the country's population has been growing steadily for decades. People needed food. They needed vegetables, fruits, dairy products, meat, and fish. For a small country, relying on imports always presents additional risks. This is especially true for products that need to be on the shelves constantly, regardless of the international situation. That is why, in the very first years of the state's existence, engineers and agronomists began to see water differently. Where others saw a common resource, they saw it as a strategic factor. Every new well was carefully studied. Every reservoir was designed with many years ahead in mind. Over time, this approach became an integral part of the national culture of resource management. Later, Israel mastered industrial-scale desalination of seawater, the reuse of treated wastewater, and the creation of agricultural projects in areas previously considered unpromising. Many of these solutions surprised experts from other countries. But even against this backdrop, fish farming remained one of the most difficult challenges. Fish are almost always associated with large bodies of water. When a person hears the phrase fish farm, they usually picture ponds, lakes, or areas along the coast. This image seems so natural that it rarely raises any doubts. That's why the idea of raising fish in the middle of a desert was long considered something completely nonsensical. Even among experts, there were many skeptics. The logic seemed simple. If water is scarce, why waste it on fish farming when there are more obvious agricultural options? A few decades ago, this question seemed perfectly reasonable. But the thing was, beneath the surface of the Negev lay a resource that for a long time almost no one took seriously. Deep underground, there are ancient aquifers. This water has been accumulating here for a long time and is noticeably different from regular fresh water. It contains a large amount of salts and various minerals. This water is not very suitable for drinking. For many agricultural crops, it also presents serious challenges. For a long time, it was seen more as a problem than as a useful resource. Nevertheless, researchers gradually began to notice an interesting pattern. Some fish species showed an ability to adapt to water with higher mineral content much better than previously thought. Moreover, for certain species, such environmental parameters turned out to be quite comfortable. What initially seemed like a limitation suddenly began to be seen as a new advantage. When I first saw the description of these projects, my expectations were limited to a small experiment, a few pools, a couple of research teams, and cautious attempts to bring an unconventional idea to life. However, as I got more familiar with the materials, it became clearer and clearer that this was on a much larger scale. The first fish farms really had some pretty humble beginnings. They drew water from deep wells, pumped it under pressure into specially prepared tanks, and then stocked them with fish. From the outside, the whole scene looked almost surreal. A dry desert stretched out all around, and right nearby was this facility that looked like it belonged on the seashore. But the real question was not whether the fish could survive for a few months. It was much more important to determine if it was possible to create a system designed for long-term operation. A one-time experiment and sustainable production are two very different things. That is exactly when the most serious challenges began. A lot of the early projects involved endless checks and adjustments. Scientists had to figure out which fish species would adapt and grow fastest in that specific water, which ones could better tolerate changes in the chemical composition, and still be profitable to raise. A single mistake meant losing an entire season. So, every decision was made with extreme caution. The water was drawn from deep underground, where the temperature stayed relatively constant throughout the year. This unexpectedly turned into a major advantage. Farmers, on the surface, often have to deal with drastic temperature fluctuations. Here, however, that part of the problem just took care of itself, thanks to the properties of the underground layers. For many types of fish, a stable environment is vitally important. Sudden temperature spikes cause stress, slow down their growth, and increase the risk of infections. For this reason, the consistency of the conditions turned out to be just as important as the water's chemical composition. However, along with the benefits, new challenges arose. The water's mineral content needed constant supervision. Some substances were present in safe concentrations, while others required almost non-stop monitoring. Any miscalculation could lead to serious losses. As the farms grew, the cost of such mistakes increased significantly. Gradually, a whole network of technological solutions began to form around the pools. Automatic sensors, pump systems, monitoring systems, and water purification equipment started to appear. The modern fish farmer looked less and less like a guy with a fishing rod by a pond. In many cases, his job was closer to managing a complex industrial plant. Particular importance was given to the oxygen level. Fish constantly consume it, and at high water temperatures, maintaining the necessary balance proves to be a difficult task. This is precisely why the compressors and aeration systems ran almost continuously. The reliability of these devices played a crucial role. Even a serious failure could lead to noticeable consequences within just a few hours. If you approach a farm like this early in the morning, the first impression is quite unusual. A light fog hangs over the pools. You can hear the monotonous hum of equipment. And all around stretches a dry landscape, almost devoid of any signs of life. The contrast between the technological complex and the surrounding desert is especially striking. It creates a feeling that these two worlds shouldn't even be next to each other. However, this is exactly the kind of scene that gradually became common in certain parts of the Negev. As they gained experience, specialists understood better and better which fish species were suited for such conditions. Some showed good results in the initial stages, but turned out to be too sensitive to environmental changes. Others developed more slowly, but tolerated fluctuations in water parameters better. Each farm essentially kept its own statistics, comparing performance season after season. Over time, the set of optimal species became more and more obvious. Certain saltwater fish species were of particular interest. At first glance, the very idea seems paradoxical. Saltwater fish are usually associated with the coast, ports, and saltwater bays. But the mineralized water from deep underground aquifers, in some cases, creates conditions similar to what these species are adapted to in the wild. For many observers, this specific point became the most unexpected part of the whole story. Gradually, the engineers realized they were working with more than just pools and fish. They were faced with a system where almost every parameter influenced the final outcome. Water circulation speed, fish stocking density, the oxygen supply schedule, the feeding routine, and a host of other factors were all interconnected. Changing one component often had a ripple effect on the entire farm's operation. It's worth noting that around the same years, other arid regions of the planet were trying to solve similar problems. Some were building new canals. Some were searching for additional freshwater sources. And others were experimenting with artificial reservoirs. But in the Negev, the path turned out to be different. Here, the main focus wasn't on finding new volumes of water, but on making the most efficient use of the resources they already had. This approach required a completely different way of thinking. Instead of the question of where to get more water, a totally different question came up more often: how to get the most benefit out of every cubic meter that the farm already had at its disposal. It was this logic that gradually became the key factor in the further development of the fish farms and paved the way for the next important stage. Over time, the farm owners faced a new challenge. Yes, the fish were growing successfully, but what should be done with the water after a growing cycle was finished? Simply draining it would mean losing a valuable resource, especially in a region where water is valued not just in money, but also in the colossal effort required to obtain it. This is where the story of fish farms goes beyond just regular aquaculture. It became clear that the water, after being used in the tanks, doesn't lose all its properties at all. It still contains substances that, with the right approach, can be used again. What is considered waste in one process can become a useful resource in another. Some farmers started combining fish farming with growing agricultural crops. The water from the tanks was reused to water the plants and provide them with essential nutrients. This kind of method allowed them to get an extra benefit without increasing their water consumption. Over time, systems like these came to be seen as a very promising direction for development. A specific chain was formed where one process flowed smoothly into another. First, the water was used for raising fish. Then it was applied to other tasks. Thanks to this, every pull of water from the deep well brought more benefits compared to traditional setups. For an arid region, that kind of efficiency was a huge deal. On the surface, solutions like these might seem like minor technical details. But it's often these little things that a project's reliability hangs on. A single successful engineering solution rarely changes the whole picture by itself. What turns out to be much more important is the combination of many small improvements that, over time, make the system more reliable, budget-friendly, and sustainable. Year after year, the farms became more technologically advanced. Filtration systems were perfected, water quality control methods improved, and energy losses were reduced. Many processes that used to require constant human intervention were gradually automated. This not only made it possible to increase efficiency, but also to respond more quickly to problems as they came up. At the same time, the desert itself kept reminding them of its unique challenges. Sandstorms could damage the equipment. High temperatures put a greater strain on the pumps and cooling systems. Any breakdown required immediate intervention, because living organisms can't wait for several days of repairs. That's why the reliability of the technology became one of the key factors for success. A significant number of difficulties also arose during the early stages of operation. Some materials wore out faster than expected due to the water's composition. Certain technical solutions worked well in theory, but showed different results under real-world conditions. Therefore, most of the accumulated experience came not from successes, but from correcting mistakes. If you trace the reports over different years, it becomes clear that development rarely followed a predetermined plan. Researchers often had to adjust their own assumptions. Sometimes problems popped up where no one expected to see them. In other cases, potentially serious risks turned out to be less significant than initially thought. This is exactly how the practical knowledge base was gradually built. This is why modern farms look much more confident than their early prototypes. Behind every fine-tuned process are years of observation, calculations, and experiments. Many solutions that seem obvious today had to be found literally through trial and error. This journey made it possible to turn an unusual idea into a system that actually works. By that time, the farms had ceased to be mere laboratory experiments. They had to solve a different problem. It's much easier to raise fish than to sell it at a competitive market price. The customer cares very little about how unique the growing conditions are. What matters to them is the product's quality, its cost, and the consistency of supply. So, the farm owners began to think not only about biology and engineering, but also about smart logistics. At first glance, transporting fish from a desert region seems like a minor issue compared to pumping water from deep underground aquifers. However, it is precisely at these stages that unexpected costs often pop up. The product needs to be delivered to processors quickly, with strict temperature control and no delays. The farther the farm is from major transportation routes, the more critical organizing the entire supply chain becomes. The climate created additional challenges. In the summer, temperatures in some parts of the Negev get so high that the equipment starts working under a heavy load. The pumps, compressors, and control systems have to run almost non-stop. While on a regular farm you might be able to put some problems off until the next day, that is usually not an option in fish farming. The equipment that supplied oxygen was especially critical. Fish can handle many changes in their environment much better than they can a sharp drop in the water's oxygen concentration. That is why even brief failures required immediate attention. For this reason, many farms gradually equipped themselves with backup power sources and additional safety mechanisms. Over time, it became clear that the main resource of these farms was not in the pools or the wells. The most valuable asset turned out to be the accumulated experience. A new well can be drilled again. New equipment can be purchased. But the knowledge of how the entire system behaves under real-world operating conditions in the desert is impossible to gain without many years of practice. However, even when the technology started to work consistently, a new question arose. They had learned how to raise the fish. Now they had to sell it. And here, the owners ran into an unexpected problem. Many customers simply did not believe that the fish was actually raised in the desert. To them, it sounded so unusual that they had to literally explain where the product came from. Skepticism didn't just come from buyers. Some experts were also cautious about the projects. On paper, everything looked great. However, it's one thing to get results for a year, and a completely different thing to sustain production over several decades. That's why the first farms were constantly under close watch. A lot of people were just waiting for the moment the system would show its weak spots. But the most surprising thing wasn't the fish farming itself. In some parts of the Negev, the underground water contains so much salt that its composition is more like seawater than regular freshwater. This is precisely why certain farms were able to raise species of fish that are typically associated exclusively with the seacoast. In essence, some of the fish spent their entire lives hundreds of kilometers from the sea, without ever seeing it once. Few people are aware that at the same time, fish farms were popping up in the Negev. Another industry emerged. This was the breeding of ornamental aquarium fish for export. They used the same wells, the same mineralized water, but the market is completely different. Guppies, swordtails, cichlids, and many exotic species are raised in open-air pools. After that, the fish are flown to pet stores in Europe. For many farms, this niche business turned out to be more attractive than selling fish for food, since ornamental fish are sold individually and cost incomparably more than their weight. The farms had a whole other story with birds, one almost completely unrelated to the water itself. The open pools in the middle of the desert became a rare source of easy pickings for migratory cormorants, herons, and pelicans. These birds make a stopover in the Negev on their way from Africa to Europe. For the farms, this turned into a constant battle, complete with nets over the pools, sonic deterrents, and employees standing guard at dawn. Ornithologists saw the situation from a different angle. The farms had accidentally created artificial watering holes in places where there was previously physically nowhere for the birds to stop. As a result, some migration routes began to shift specifically because of this. A separate area of development has to do with genetics. After several generations of raising fry in saltwater, specialists noticed that fish from local lines tolerated high mineralization much better compared to individuals brought directly from the coast. This led to the idea of selective breeding, where they began to select not just large and healthy fish for breeding, but those whose offspring consistently adapted better to the specific water composition of that particular well. This is how some farms developed their own, essentially in-house, lines of fish. This kind of fish isn't found anywhere else in the world. The issue of diseases was a topic that farm owners preferred not to bring up for public discussion. A closed tank with a high density of fish creates the perfect conditions for an infection to spread rapidly. A single introduced pathogen could wipe out the entire farm in a matter of days. That's why, over time, strict biosecurity protocols were developed. New batches of fry go through quarantine. Separate clothing and footwear are provided for each tank, and moving equipment between sections is strictly forbidden. To outsiders, this strict discipline might seem like overkill. However, it's precisely what separates the farms that have been operating for decades from those that shut down after their very first disease outbreak. Sunlight, the desert's main enemy during the summer, eventually became one of its resources. Some farms switched to using solar panels to power their pumps and compressors. The reason wasn't about being green, but about practical calculations. Diesel fuel has to be shipped in from far away, whereas the sun in the Negev shines abundantly all year round. An almost ironic picture emerged. The equipment that protects the fish from the water getting too hot is itself powered by the energy from the very sun that heats up the water. Over time, the struggle for underground water resources led to less pleasant consequences. The wells that supplied water to the fish farms were also needed by farmers growing dates and vegetables, and by the Bedouin communities in the southern parts of the country. The allocation of water rights periodically became a source of conflict between different groups of users who were forced to share the same limited resource. In this respect, the fish farms were not an isolated technical success. They became part of an already existing and not always peaceful dispute over who should get water and in what quantity. A unique twist occurred when it became clear that Israel's key export product in this sector wasn't so much the fish itself, but rather the accumulated knowledge and experience. Companies that grew out of the Negev farmers' experience began supplying closed-loop recirculation system technologies outside the country, to places like the Persian Gulf countries, Southeast Asia, and even North America. This is a rare case where years of experiments and mistakes, conducted in a specific part of the desert, turned into a full-fledged product. It's something that can be completely packaged and sold, along with engineers, blueprints, and years of data on equipment failures. Climate change brought its own adjustments to this situation. The rise in average temperatures increased the load on cooling system equipment and made the summer months even more hazardous for its operation. For some warm water fish species, the rise in groundwater temperature turned out to be more of an advantage, as it accelerated their growth and shortened the production cycle time. Farms that not long ago viewed heat as nothing but a threat have gradually learned to harness some of its aspects for their own benefit. It's fascinating to see how the perspective of insurance companies and banks on these kinds of projects has evolved. In the beginning, when these farms were just getting started, no financial institution was able to accurately assess the inherent risks. This was because success simultaneously depends on the stability of ancient aquifers, the rate of pipe deterioration caused by saltwater, and the behavior of migratory birds. Over time, specialized risk assessment methods were developed, tailored specifically to aquaculture in desert environments, and were created based on years of analyzing accidents and insurance claims in the Negev region. Essentially, the industry has created its own financial language, which helps to accurately describe and evaluate its unique risks. Nowadays, if you take into account the ornamental fish, the farms, the technology, exports, and related agricultural projects that use recycled water, it adds up to a significant part of the entire region's economy. Half a century ago, this region was considered practically lifeless. The desert remained a desert, the heat didn't let up, and the amount of water didn't increase. Over long decades of painstaking work that often didn't yield immediate results, they learned to extract a benefit from a resource that seemed completely useless, something no one could have even imagined half a century ago. Perhaps the most amazing thing about this story is that it has no end. Each new year brings a new type of fish, an updated breeding line, and another country where Israeli equipment is being sent. The Negev desert has not become a sea, and isn't trying to. However, it has learned to exist, as if something far more valuable than what meets the eye is hidden beneath its sands.